Thank you very much for the wonderful brief take on the Trump win and what will happen next. While we let Mike take a break, since we are now in a world of craziness and chaos, to say the least, not only in the U.S., Trump, someone who was not expected to win, actually won the election. But at the same time, in Europe, things seem to be more chaotic with Brexit and so on. So we're really fortunate to have Mr. Wallenberg with us today while he is visiting Hong Kong. And we would like to hear his view or give us a European take on the Trump win and what is happening, how Europeans are viewing the U.S. election and so on. Mr. Wallenberg?
Thank you. Well, very happy to be here. I'm not 100% sure that I can represent all Europeans' views on Mr. Trump, but and I'm not sure that is what I'd like to get into either. But I think that, as Mike was talking about earlier, Europe is going through some tremendous challenges right now, which has to be dealt with over time. And perhaps besides the immigration issue and all the refugees coming through the borders, which is putting a lot of strain, not only economically, but also, of course, from a society point of view and in terms of taking care of those people who are actually in need. We also have a period of very sluggish growth that came after the financial crisis that we've just been passing through, with very high debt levels in governments and therefore little room for expansion on the fiscal side in many countries in Europe. So that's one side of the issues that are being trying to take care of from a policy point of view. Now, at the same time, during earlier this year, we learned very abruptly and we learned it twice this year that what is unexpected can actually very much happen. Most people thought, I think in Europe, that Brexit, and not the least Prime Minister Cameron, thought that the Brexit was not an issue, that they would actually come through that election, and it didn't appear. And I think for many of us, and not the least many countries in Scandinavia and Northern Europe, we have always seen Britain as a very important factor in terms of supporting free trade, an open-minded attitude towards commercial and business issues, and in many ways a leader in Europe for pro-business activity, suddenly taking a step to the side and not being part of it. And the Brexit issue, in my mind, raises, of course, a lot of questions, but not only for Britain, actually, but also, I think, lots of issues that we have to deal with in those of us who are remaining within the EU. Because EU also is going through a number of questions around the internal market, around not only social issues, not only immigration, but now in the last few years also around the question of security and defense. And all these issues, of course, bringing a lot of questions to the table. For those of us who also happen to be free trade minded, the question about TTIP is a very sad development. We have been, for many of us, especially in Northern Europe, we have been fighting for the transatlantic pact that would actually not only gain for business in Europe, but also, we believe, to a very large extent, the United States as well. And having the hopes seeing diminished quite substantially, and perhaps even more after the US election, is not a very good sign, because protectionism is very much a hurting factor for business. I remember that we all, since I work with the bank on an everyday basis, we all went to Washington, D.C. for one of the World Bank IMF meetings immediately after the financial crisis 08-09. And one of the principal G20 messages was to avoid getting into the protectionist area. Unfortunately, I think a lot of indications are going in the opposite direction. And that, I believe, will also be a big factor for Europe to consider going forward. So with that, let me say that if I was sitting in Brussels, I would be mindful of not only what has been going on in the US election, but of course only what is in Brexit. But why don't I stop there, because I think we should listen to Victor as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So we also have a great representation here of the trade community in Hong Kong and in Asia. That is Dr. Victor Fung. As many of you know, he is the chairman of Li and Fung, and Li and Fung has been at the forefront of the globalization campaigns and development over more than a century. So Li and Fung will celebrate its 110th anniversary, so that just shows if there's any one or any institution that has played a big role in globalization, Li and Fung is it. So I'm very curious, as many of you are, what Victor thinks of the Trump win really means going forward.
Okay, thank you, Zhiwu. Well, first of all, I would like to just extend my own personal welcome to all of you. It's a great event for AGI, and thank you for coming today. And I really like to thank you, Marcus, and you, Mike, for really gracing us with the presence today. I think this is very, very timely to hear your views. The impact of Trump's being elected on Asia, if I can sort of respond to that, I think, frankly, you got to look at it in different time frames and in different sectors. I would say that if you ask me for an overall reaction, I'm actually not that pessimistic. I think in the medium to the long term, if I focus initially on trade and investment, I think actually it's reasonably optimistic. We know that Mr. Trump is going to approach things completely from a fresh perspective. We also know that he is clearly looking at American interest. And also his agenda, if you would, as you mentioned, Mike, is not cluttered, if you would, with, shall we say, non-economic aspects. So he's looking for a deal, and he's a deal maker. So in the medium and long term, I think the idea of coming to some sort of accommodation, if you would, with Asia in general and China in particular, I think I'm actually fairly hopeful. But in the short term, I think like any negotiator, he's going to show that he has a lot of bargaining strength. And he will actually show that by taking some immediate action. The Chinese will say, "Ha ma wei," and really, show that there is some teeth to the negotiating side. But I think basically my reading of Mr. Trump's whole approach is he may not like the multilateral approach or maybe large regional deals in which he would think that America's bargaining leverage is somewhat compromised by the need to take care of everybody in the group, so to speak. And I think if, in fact, things like the TPP falls away, or very unfortunate TTIP falls away, he may fairly quickly replace that with a series of bilateral negotiations so that trade will still go on, unfortunately, in my view, from a more spaghetti bowl basis. But it will be clear and it will go forward. And I think that is actually the interesting one thing about the Brexit. My view is I look for a fairly early bilateral between the UK and the US for reasons on both sides. And that may, in fact, be a cushioning factor for a hard exit, for the UK. But anyway, that's almost as a side. Coming back to Asia, I think he will probably show some fairly tough measures initially vis-a-vis China, just to show that he has the strength. And, you know, there's a lot of talk about, you know, sort of trade protectionist measures. I think the whole idea of anti-dumping will be resurrected. You know, there are already several actions now ongoing and actually on steel, and I think that will continue. And I think those will be some of the initial assessments. Naming China as a currency manipulator, actually, if you really study it, I don't know what it really means at the end of the day. But actually, the PR, perhaps, especially at the consumer level, is probably not very good. And what it may do, of course, if they really do name China as a currency manipulator, the real bite isn't that much, but it may pave the way for a more popular sentiment for Mr. Trump to actually look for actually increased tariffs on certain categories. And he would have to, of course, go to Congress. But if China is named as a currency manipulator, then going to Congress will have perhaps some more popular move behind it, and hence have a better opportunity of getting it through Congress. So it is something in the longer term. But you know what I think from a more global, multilateral perspective, frankly, you know, what Mr. Trump is now bringing to the world may, in fact, is the wake-up call, or you know, from whatever view that the world needs to really make some very fundamental changes. We all know that the multilateral institutions that are called the Bretton Woods institutions that we've had for 70 years now is in bad need of repair. And nobody has really taken the move to actually do that. If Mr. Trump really gets out of TPP and doesn't do TTIP, then I think there is going to be a vacuum, as you mentioned, Mike, in which people have to think, okay, what is going to move into that vacuum? Now, the hope, from my standpoint, and I think Mr. Trump even, or some commentator even mentioned, maybe if the U.S. joins AIIB, that may in fact be a completely new movement in the world to create a new multilateral system. And that impact, I think, will be tremendous and tremendously beneficial for the world. On the more concerning side, in terms of global impact, I go back to the last 2 points you made, Mike. I think the impact on climate change is, if Mr. Trump is really serious about pulling out from the Paris Accords, I think it's going to be very, very serious. You know, as you know, it hasn't been ratified yet in Congress. And if he doesn't really support it and move it through, and if the U.S. doesn't participate, I think it's going to be a pretty sad day for climate change and our responsibility to future generations. Now, on the good side of that is, we all know that in the 13th five-year plan that's just been promulgated by China, what China has agreed to in the Paris Accords is already in the 13th five-year plan. So you may see that the lead for climate change globally may shift from the U.S., in fact, to China. And China may be the one leading and pushing the whole climate change issue. So that's really, I think, going to be an important global impact, in my mind, of the Trump election. Now, the final point, I think, is the inclusiveness. My own view, and Marcus, I certainly agree with you. If you look at Brexit, what's happened there, and you look at the situations in almost many countries in Europe, you look at, you know, the election of Mr. Trump, and frankly, all over Asia, there is a huge problem of inequality of income. Now, that is a problem that has really been with us for a while now. And frankly, I must say the policymakers, the elite, if you would, have chosen to really not address it head on for a long, long time. I always like to use the analogy, we keep kind of pushing it back as, well, this is a migraine headache, that will go away. The distribution will, you know, right itself over time. But unfortunately, I think it's gotten worse. A series of migraine headaches, it turned out to be a brain tumor. And so I think we better actually address this issue head on. So one of my greatest hopes of the Trump presidency, I think there are a lot of things that people are concerned about in terms of unexpectedness and new measures and so on. I hope he will do something about this fundamental, shall we say, the 99% versus the 1% problem, and start to do something like that. And I think it's not a tax issue, as you rightly point out, right? I think it's an issue of creating upward mobility in society and really addressing people who felt that they have been excluded, especially, as you pointed out in the election, the white middle class has just been ignored. And I think a lot of the so-called silent majority have also been ignored in the Brexit situation. And I think these issues needs to be addressed head on. And I think with this new approach that Mr. Trump would bring to the U.S., and maybe U.S. itself would take the lead in addressing this issue of a much fairer, much more inclusive growth, much fairer distribution of income. And I think that's a worldwide problem that we need to actually deal with. Otherwise, we will continue to get black swans like the Brexit and so on. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Victor. So this is a long list of points and topics. Let me get back to the fundamental changes you mentioned. Yes, on the one hand, more fundamental changes are being demanded by voters, not just in the US, but across Europe and many other countries. At the same time, there seems to be a lack of leadership, internationally speaking. What I'm referring to is the fact that in the US, Trump will almost surely retreat somewhat from, making the US be the strongest, by far dominating leader on the international stage. And then the old world, that is Western Europe, is going to be self-engaged, sorting things through after Brexit and so on. So who is going to be leading the fundamental changes to make the world order, international order, maybe adjusted well enough so that we get ready for another round of globalization? So Victor, would you like to comment on this some more?
Nobody? I mean, no, I don't know. I actually, just as briefly as I can, I actually think, we're in a period where, for a variety of different reasons, we're going to be self-preoccupied at the national level, and we're going to have to live with some volatility that goes with absence of international cooperation and coordination. This is a kind of short version. Zhiwu.
So then that means probably more opportunities and more roles to be played by China. It's interesting that China has benefited from the current international order, at least for the last 30 years or so. So if China would take the lead to introduce and implement some fundamental changes, what would China actually do in terms of specific efforts and changes? Victor?
Well, Zhiwu, I agree with you. I think there is, both it's basically both a danger and an opportunity here, as in the whole, again, the old Chinese concept of crisis. Obviously, we know what the downside risk is. Protectionism really rears its ugly head. We're going to have huge number of problems. Frankly, I don't think that's going to be the way. I think the world is much too interconnected today for people to truly close their walls. I think it's absolutely irreversible, among other things because of this little machine. So I think what we're going to be thinking through is a new world order in which the concept of multilateralism would need to be looked at again. First of all, I think the distribution of power, as Mike, you pointed out, it's not going to be a unipolar world. It's going to be a multipolar world. And I think China will take its place, with Europe and with America in terms of sorting that out. And I think we're going to give a lot more weight to the if you would, the voice of the developing economies. If you look at the weight of the international markets, obviously 30 years ago, most of the markets were, in fact, almost all the markets were in the West, right? The West accounted for 83% of global consumption in 1980. Today, it's about 70-30 already. And with the growth of the middle class and the faster growing developing economies, by the middle of the century, it's going to shift to 50-50. And then the bulk of the markets is actually in the developing world. Now, if you look at investment flows and so on, a lot of the investment flows will come from the developing economies and in a way from the East. So I think there's going to be a multilateral system that will be much more reflective of this new reality. And I'm just hopeful that we morph into that, not through a conflict, God forbid, but through now a series. And the wake-up calls that we're receiving with the presidency of Mr. Trump and the Brexit, I think it's probably a good wake-up call for the world to actually move in that fashion. Now, that's at the country-to-country multilateral level. And then I like to emphasize again, within each country, the much fairer distribution of income is an absolutely fundamental problem gnawing at us in the whole system. And we really got to address that. And the answer is not really through taxation. Now, I have no answer, frankly, for the climate change issue. I think the climate change issue, we really got to have the commitment and believe in the science that we have a serious problem of, really not bequeathing a wrong world to the future generations. And as you say, it's something that maybe politically you can afford to sort of disregard for the short term because it's not going to hurt you in the next few years. But it will hurt you and hurt you very badly in the long term. I have no answer for that other than fundamental commitment from the heart.
So does any of you have a big concern about a possible repeat of the 1930s and 1940s, in the sense that, if you look at history, after the 1929 stock market crash, the Great Depression in the US and Europe led to a lot of protectionism, which led to a lot of conflicts, which we call the Second World War and so on. So Marcus, would you like to share some?
That was
thoughts?
a cheery question. I think that, I guess that what we're seeing to a certain respect right now with these two elections that we refer to, Brexit and Trump, is a fear among people of what is happening to their jobs, happening to their societies. And perhaps that is one of the main reasons why these two elections have come about in the way they have. But I also think that we all who are living in the world of business the last few years have felt that there has been quite a bit of apprehension to engage and to really try to develop our businesses as much as we would like them to do. There are a number of factors that have been, in my view, been influencing that specific situation and which has also led to lackluster growth. We talked about protectionism. We have talked about the uncertainty on the global security arena. But I also guess that one thing that has been worrying people in the business world to really invest has not only been that bank regulation has been very, very tough in the last few years in order to try to protect the financial system of the world, but on top of that, a situation where in most industries, or in many traditional industries, we already have quite a bit of overcapacity. I mean, if you look into white goods, you look into steel, you look into cars, there has been more capacity than actually has been called for. And on top of this, we've gone through a period which I'm not going to, it's very hard to criticize but at this point in time, but I think we have to realize, and Mike was into this a bit earlier, we have been through a period of an unusual monetary policy experiment with a lot of liquidity being pumped into the financial markets, very low interest rates, and despite all this, and despite low commodity prices, the willingness to invest has been very, very low. And on top of this, we're also going through a period of tremendous technological change. I mean, we talk a lot about the internet and the disruptive business models being developed that way, but we also see in the possibilities in big data and artificial intelligence, etc., 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 which on the one hand will increase productivity and offer more services, but on the other hand is a threat to jobs. So it's not strange that we are living in a period of some fear of the persons on the street. And then what can there be done? So I think that one opportunity Mr. Trump would have as a president, and which I think China to a certain extent already has done, is to develop green infrastructure, to support jobs, to support investments, and perhaps with the better utilization of private and public partnerships, get lots of the liquidity that is today circulating, looking for a good yield in the financial markets, come to good use to create clean energy, clean water, clean transportation, etc., which also should create some jobs. And here, I think that from what Mr. Trump has been talking, this particular area, although there are many other issues that have created uncertainty, but on this particular point, he does have an opportunity to bring some good.
Yeah. So Mike, you must be pretty well rested now. Huh? So now let me get you to work. Many people, especially politicians, blame globalization for rising inequality or for the situation of the American middle class and so on. Why do you think it's so difficult for more acceptance and understanding of the benefits of globalization? So what should we economists and professors really do to change the situation?
Danny Roderick just wrote something I highly recommend anybody who's interested in this read on Project Syndicate. Danny's the leading development economist of his generation and a superb commentator on these things. And what I'll just kind of in short form repeat what Danny said. One, economists sold the proposition, which is true, that the net benefits are positive and large from trade, and almost ignored the fact there were distributional consequences. This used to make the late Paul Samuelson furious, by the way. I mean, he'd go nuts. Then we got around to sort of, acknowledging this, but we always said, this is Danny's main point, I think it's fundamentally right. We said there are big diffuse benefits from trade, innovation, productivity, lower cost goods, and so on. And then there's these specific costs. And we portrayed the situation as the anti-trade people, had their own vested local interests. And those had to be resisted. And that's why we as economists, and who talk about policy, downplayed the distributional aspects. And what Danny says is both sides have special interests. There's a bunch of people who lobby and have a lot of money to get it done, who have an interest in the open markets, and another bunch of people. And we should have taken a more balanced approach. And that, so he says, our contribution to this thing was to have failed to do this, to acknowledge this is a two-sided thing. I guess the only other thing I would say is, in my view, the reason I'm somewhat pessimistic about this is that ideology is going to get in the way. You cannot solve this problem by redistributing income, in part, because it has efficiency consequences, and in part because that's not the only thing people care about. They care about whether the family job in manufacturing that 3 generations did has disappeared, right? That's not income. That's self-esteem and a bunch of things like that. So I think we have to tackle this intergenerationally. And the reason I'm enthusiastic about the Northern European countries is they've worked very hard over a long period of time with lots of controversy, Marcus. I think you might agree with this, and you could certainly elaborate, on balancing these things. And to me, the most fundamental thing, complementary thing to a reasonable approach to income distribution is absolutely universally available, high-quality, essential services in education, healthcare, and other things. There's lots of different ways to deliver it, but that seems to me to be the core rock bottom. It addresses the distributional problem, but more importantly, it addresses the problem that Victor talked about, which is, a level playing field and equality of opportunity and so on. So I think that's where we have to go if we're going to sort of search out solutions of this over time and bring our societies back together. Whether we're going to do it or not, it's kind of an open question.
You said it all, Mike. The only thing I would add is we definitely have a problem of a much more even distribution of income. I think economists for decades, for generations, have actually ignored the distribution issue. Basically, the assumption is if you make the pie bigger and bigger, the market is perfect and the redistribution of income will take care of itself, but it didn't. Therefore, it's a problem. But I think what we really need to remember, and that is a very important argument for continued globalization, is if you try to do redistribution of any sort or provide upward mobility of any sort, in a situation in which the economic pie is shrinking, I would say it's almost impossible. So my view is that you've got to do both at the same time. And you must continue the progress of increasing the economic pie at the same time dealing explicitly with the distribution income of issue. I don't think taxing is the answer. And there are other benefits and positive and et cetera of reducing taxes and so on. So I don't want to get into that debate. But what you really need to do, in my view, is providing upward mobility in society. And that may come with education, that may come with creating opportunities, and maybe at the end of the day, it comes back to jobs and job creation and the types of jobs. And I think at the back of this, sometimes we blame all the world's woes on globalization. I'm a great defender of globalization. I say there's another great thing that the world has done, which is technological change. That has probably done more to destroy jobs in many ways, in sectors than anything. But I'm not going to say technological innovation is not a good idea. It's a damn good idea, but how do you actually manage that? Yeah. And how you direct that is the issue.
I come from a very small society of 10 million people or less, and an area of Northern Europe that is about 25 million citizens. So we have a slightly different problem than if you work in Shanghai. But coming back to your point, one thing that might be interesting, I agree with Mike that you need to be able to supply with essential services, and you have to work very, very closely with education, because that's going to be an extremely important part. But I think that where I come from, Sweden, you can take a company like Electrolux, which is closely related to my family, don't take me hard on the numbers here, but say that 25 years ago, Electrolux had 50 factories in Sweden, and today they have 2. And that means that for a government which proposes to have a completely open trade policy towards the rest of the world, you have to find policies how to make people accept change. Because we can't stop changing. The minute we stop changing, we are stopping progression and forward motion. And we have to continue to develop and to change. But for people to accept that this change will take place, one has to find some sort of a safety net that for temporary times when new jobs are being created, you have some sort of a safety net and you have the possibility to retrain and thereby finding a new job. So that has been one factor that has been very, very important in this. Yeah, but not taking away the demand that you have to continue to find a new job, but in a new setting, because there are always new jobs coming up.
Victor, would you were going to say something?
No.
Okay. Okay. Let me ask one more question about U.S.-China relations. I assume many of us in this audience are very curious. What do you think? Which way the U.S.-China relations will go? Let me make it more specific. Assuming that Trump would be in the White House for the next 8 years. So in 8 years' time, between China and the U.S., 8 years from now, what will be the relation? What would the U.S.-China relations look like 8 years from now? Mike.
Oh, okay. So we'll all take a shot at it. On balance, I think it will be okay for the reasons that Victor talked about before. But I do think there's a problem that, and it's on both sides. Americans have an astonishingly poor working knowledge of China. Mm-hmm. And so, it's easy to sell sort of relatively silly things about China, whether it's in the political process and so on. And this is in spite of the fact that the media gives a fairly balanced, I mean, the Chinese authorities wouldn't agree with this, but the media gives a reasonably balanced picture of what's going on. But somehow people, don't know it. So Trump can get away with this statement that the currency is still undervalued as the money's pouring out of and the central bank's using up reserves in the PBOC. So I do think there's some, earlier in the post-war period, there were important leaders in Europe, in America, in Asia, who felt that contact between people and real kind of basic knowledge of who the other folks are was kind of important. And I think we've lost a little bit of that. And if we get it back, we'll have built a solider foundation for the kind of relationship that we want between these two countries so that they can basically provide leadership in this, in managing this global world we live in.
Yeah.
So the two countries will be on better terms 8 years from now, or worse?
Well, it's not so good now, so I guess, I don't know whether it's a prediction or a hope, but I'd say better.
Well, Zhiwu, I think, let me start from the standpoint that, the bilateral relationship between China and the U.S. is the most important bilateral relationship in the world. Not that there's a G2. I don't believe in a G2. I don't think U.S. and China together can move the world. However, I think if U.S. and China do not agree, okay, I don't think you're going to get global agreements. So it's a necessary but not sufficient condition. So I look at it, first of all, from that standpoint. I think we're getting into a period in which America will be looking after its own interests and a lot more domestic issues. In that sense, turning a little bit more inward, I hope not protectionist, but inward. And you have a president that is looking after American interest. And what is the long-term American interest? If you really look through what's on the surface, I think is fundamentally to look for a working relationship with China. I chose my words carefully. Because I think it's very important to recognize that between America and China, it is not a zero-sum game. It's not if I win, you lose, if you win, I lose. It is a non-zero-sum game. There are areas in which US and China can cooperate to great effect, and we saw the benefits of that in the Paris climate change talks, and if they actually ever get together in creating a multilateral trade system or whatever, I think there's a good chance that the rest of the world would be able to join in. They also, I would say, fundamentally have different objectives and would compete in a lot of dimensions. So we're really going into an era in which the relationship is much more mature. You know, it's not, are you a friend or are you a foe? You know, it's not a win or lose situation. It's a relationship in which you may compete on some things and you cooperate on others. And I think that's the, you know, some people call it the new sort of new relationship between the new power relationship. You know, it's this idea that it is actually a complex, multi-period, you know, non-zero-sum game. That you just got to get used to the idea. It's both, you know, a competitor and cooperative. So I think it's a maturity of that relationship that I'll be looking for. And frankly, I'm not sure that Mr. Trump isn't the one to actually implement that. You know, if I can sort of, you know, that may sound a little strange, because I don't think he has a lot of ideological baggage, if that's the right way to put it. And he looks at a very realistic situation that the world is today. And I think he's recognizing, he got elected because I think he recognizes certain important developments within America. And I think those issues are actually global. And so I am actually quite optimistic in the medium and long term. There will be friction in the short term. No, I am looking for that. And from a, you know, private sector standpoint, I think the future actually is quite bright, you know, from an investment and trade standpoint. But I think in the short term, I would look for, you know, really a policy of diversification and sort of hedging many bets. And I think you don't want to operate just in one country. You want to operate in a large number of countries and have a portfolio of routes to actually do this. And I think the world actually will be moving into, as I said earlier, a series of bilateral free trade agreements. You know, and you know, what the economists have been afraid in the past of saying, you know, during the Doha round negotiation, there will be a spaghetti bowl. I think, unfortunately, it will be a spaghetti bowl, but it's a spaghetti bowl that could be managed, especially with people who are familiar with the international trading and have the diversification. So actually, I am actually optimistic about this long-term relationship between U.S. and China.
This is just a note that I think the tone of what we've been saying is, I think, realistic but cautiously optimistic in a number of dimensions. There is a fairly large amount of damage that's been done in terms of internal social cohesion. I mean, there are people in the United States who are terrified about what's coming. It was one of the crudest campaigns in anybody's memory, you know, with lack of civility, stupid, you know. There's not going to be a wall, and it's now a few fences. There's not going to be a 45% tariff. There's racist overtones. One person who is associated with that, you know, has been appointed a senior advisor. We're not out of the woods yet, at least on our side now. How that spills over into issues that are relevant here is a little hard to predict, but there's a darker side to this.
No, I totally agree with that, Mike. In fact, Marcus, I'd like to, if I may, Zhiwu, ask Marcus, how, with Trump's election, how is that going to be impacting the whole EU and the pressures that Brexit has already put on the EU in terms of its cohesion?
I think it seems to me that the rhetoric pre-election might be quite different from what really happens. I hope so anyway. And I think one of the reasons why lots of reaction have come out of Europe the last few days is because of everybody realizing how important the transatlantic link actually is. But thinking about what you said on the United States and China, I think that whatever happens here, that relationship also for Europe will be crucial. And that the mutual respect between those two nations will be crucial for all of us going forward, not the least in trade and investment, because that example set by the two countries will also positively or negatively impact what happens in our backyard, Europe as well. So it's crucial.
Okay, in the interest of time, I have to sum up with a few words. First, as Mike nicely summarized, it's uncertain, and we don't know what he's going to do. So the next 8 months will be rocky, using Mike's word. So in the near term, a lot of uncertainty and chaos, possibly, as Mr. Trump tries it out. So if you take away and use this to arrange your own investment portfolio, so wealth preservation should be a top priority instead of trying to bet very riskily. Okay, but as Victor put it nicely, in the medium to long term, things should look really good. So if you're a long-term investor, position accordingly. And maybe after all, given all the rhetoric during the election campaign, if you like history, then you probably know that don't take the rhetorical statements too seriously, as Marcus put it nicely. So that's a very positive summary, I guess, of the post-election Trump presidency and what to expect and what not to expect. Let me also use this opportunity to advertise on behalf of AGI. So our next Global Thinkers event will be on December 14th. Next time, we'll focus on technology's impact on education and the global economy. I guess Victor already advertised how important technological innovations really are for today's economy and so on. So if you would like, you can use the information on the back of the leaflet, especially the QR code, to sign up for the next event. So again, I want to thank all of you for coming to this event. We really look forward to seeing you in mid-December or in future Global Thinkers events as well as other AGI events. Thank you all.